The name of the neighborhood was Glenridge Hollow, though you won't find it on most maps. Tucked into the edge of the Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina, Glenridge was a planned community, one of many constructed during the post-war suburban boom of the 1950s. Brick ranch homes, cul-de-sacs with names like Rose Path and Lantern Run, a central park where children once rode rusted tricycles around a dry fountain, the kind of place that faded into the trees after industry pulled away and time did its quiet work. But according to the 2020 census, Glenridge Hollow had a problem. The count was conducted, as always, by low-level field contractors hired to go door-to-door where mail-in forms failed. One of those workers, Mallory Gaines, a 29-year-old graduate student with a background in urban geography, was assigned the Glenridge sector on June 17th. What she reported would never make it into the final census. The official records show her working the tract for 3 days. The field logs, those that weren't redacted, list an unusually high number of contact-made entries. Households supposedly visited, names recorded, demographics noted. The total population tallied in her section, 3,872 individuals. There was just one problem. The Glenridge tract had been uninhabited since 1997. Records show the last utility shutoff occurred in April of that year. A water main burst, then a fire swept through several properties. The local township declared the neighborhood unfit for habitation due to contaminated soil and structural instability. The area was fenced off. No construction permits had been granted in the decades since. Satellite images from Google Earth, historical data toggled on, showed nothing but tree-choked ruins. So where did Mallory get her numbers? That's what her supervisor, James Randall, tried to find out. When he called her 3 days after her last log update, the phone rang only once. Then a strange distortion played back, static mixed with what sounded like breath. The call dropped. She was never heard from again. The last ping from her phone placed her within the Glenridge boundary, on Holloway Loop. That street doesn't exist in any known archive. But it showed up faintly in a scan of a 1961 zoning map pulled from the Asheville Planning Department basement, a street marked for future development that was never completed. Her car was found 2 weeks later in a ravine, 11 miles from Glen Ridge. Doors locked, no signs of a crash, no damage. The census ID was on the dash. Her notes, however, were missing, except for one folded piece of paper in the glove compartment. On it, written in green ink. They opened the doors again. An internal review was launched by the Census Bureau's Office of Field Operations. An informal one. Off books. It lasted 3 days before being shut down. One agent involved, whose name was later scrubbed from payroll, confided in a friend that someone's treating this like a national security breach. He claimed a black SUV had been parked outside his home for a week. No plates. This wasn't the first time Glenridge Hollow had surfaced in federal databases. In 1983, the EPA quietly dispatched a mobile survey lab to the area following reports of elevated radon levels. But the geochemical team never returned their samples. The van was recovered 6 months later, empty, interior scorched. Not burned, scorched. As if subjected to heat that left no flame. A report by Dr. Linnea Cordes, who oversaw anomalous site analysis for the Department of the Interior at the time, was filed under a restricted classification, Echo Phenomena, Category D. The report included a single chilling line. The land does not forget who lived here. And now, according to Mallory's census count, they never left. 3 weeks after Mallory Gaines vanished, an unmarked envelope arrived at the Regional Census Bureau office in Raleigh. No return address. Inside were 6 pages torn from a standard field notebook, stained and warped by water, but still legible. At the top of the first page, in her handwriting, Glenridge Hollow Day 1. The notes were fragmented, like someone writing between moments of panic. She mentioned homes that shouldn't have been there, fully intact structures with fresh paint, warm porch lights, and windows that flickered like televisions were on inside. She wrote about knocking on doors and being greeted by polite, smiling families. The names she recorded matched no one in any federal or local registry. No driver's licenses, no tax history, no school enrollments, but they responded to her as if they'd been waiting. One line stood out, underlined twice. They knew my name before I said it. Further down the page, she described walking down Holloway Loop, a street that curved in on itself like a spiral. Feels like I'm circling the same 5 houses, she wrote. But the house numbers keep going up, past 8183 twice already. She returned to the same house 4 times. White siding, red door, hanging bird cage with no bird. Each time a different man answered. Same face, same voice. But each gave a different name. She stopped asking questions after the third. That was the last page with full writing. The remaining 5 pages were filled with sketches, faces with blurred eyes, outlines of homes with windows inked completely black, a narrow cul-de-sac that ended in a wall of trees with words scrawled through the branches. We move back in. Analysts from the Department of Energy, brought in due to Glenridge's history with contaminated soil, examined the notebook. They found trace elements on the paper, strontium-90, sulfur compounds, and something else. Something not immediately identifiable. A molecular compound that doesn't exist on the standard organic chemistry charts. It wasn't man-made, nor naturally occurring. At least, not anymore. A lab tech assigned to the case suffered a seizure 43 seconds into analysis of the substance under spectrograph. His final words before collapsing were recorded on lab audio logs. She's still counting. At this point, interest in Glenridge Hollow reached outside civilian agencies. A satellite team from the NGA was instructed to perform thermal mapping of the area during nighttime hours. Their scans came back with anomalous heat signatures, thousands of them, human-sized, human-shaped, clustering along Holloway Loop, radiating no movement but constant presence, all standing still. On the third night of monitoring, the thermal feed was abruptly overridden. A new image appeared, broadcast through the encrypted satellite uplink. One single frame, an aerial view of the neighborhood, but fully restored. Lawns trimmed, driveways clean, children mid-motion, swing sets in use, no timestamp, no motion blur, like a snapshot pulled from memory. But there was one glaring problem. The angle of the shot couldn't have come from a satellite. The perspective was too low, too intimate, like it had been taken from 30 feet in the air, from someone floating directly above. That image has since been scrubbed from every server where it once lived. Only a single printed copy remains in a sealed file marked G Phantom 3872 Cassilog. One agent who viewed it described feeling like the photo was waiting for me to remember something I never lived. Later, he took his own life. In his suicide note, a line had been scribbled and then struck out multiple times, but still legible beneath the pen marks. They're not ghosts, they're residents. A former Glenridge Hollow resident named Evelyn Mercer re-entered the picture unexpectedly in late 2020. Now in her 70s and living in an assisted living facility in Asheville, Evelyn had been listed as the last registered homeowner in the neighborhood before it was condemned. For decades, she refused to speak about her time there, claiming severe memory loss, dissociation, and auditory hallucinations tied to her final years on the property. But following a minor stroke, something changed. Nurses reported that she began drawing maps, crude outlines of cul-de-sacs, street grids, tree lines. always ending in a spiral, always labeled Glenridge. One night, a nurse heard Evelyn whispering in her sleep. The words were transcribed. 3,872. I told them to leave the lights on. I told them it was too early to lock the doors. The number matched Mallory's count exactly. Officials from a Department of Health task force, posing as medical researchers, visited Evelyn shortly after. They asked about the census. They asked about the door she'd spoken of. She told them, "It was never about the homes. The homes were just where it waited. We built it with our remembering." Evelyn died 4 days later. Her body was cremated before her family could view it. The official report listed cause of death as complications from her stroke, but the nurse, who later resigned and went into seclusion, left a message with a journalist working on an unrelated piece. A voicemail, 17 seconds long. She said, "She didn't die like that. She bled from her eyes, and then every mirror in the room cracked." At the same time, and she smiled. She also mentioned a photograph taken during Evelyn's intake that hadn't been released. In the upper right corner of the image, reflected in the glass of a medicine cabinet behind her bed, was the faint silhouette of a man standing in a hallway. No face, no features, but he was wearing a suit, gray. Cross-referencing Evelyn's timeline revealed a pattern that had previously gone unnoticed. The date of her property sale, August 19, 1997, matched exactly the date listed in an earlier EPA field memo about an underground seismic hum detected in Glenridge Hollow. The phenomenon had been dismissed at the time as a shallow tectonic shift, but buried in the appendix was a line that now reads differently. Intermittent tonal signal, low frequency, cyclical, pattern consistent with active occupancy. In other words, the land was vibrating like it was full of people walking, but no one had lived there in months, except, perhaps, they never truly left. Following Evelyn's death, researchers pulled archive footage from a 1985 local news broadcast that had aired a short segment on Glenridge's family values culture. In the B-roll, children rode bikes in perfect loops. Neighbors waved from their porches. But when the footage was stabilized and enhanced, a subtle detail emerged. Every person in frame moved in rhythm. Same stride, same wave pattern, same blink cycle. It was imperceptible at full speed. But slowed down, it looked rehearsed, like actors following a choreographed loop. And behind them, at the edge of the street, stood one figure who did not move at all. He was present in 3 different shots, same spot, different angles, unmoving. His outline flickered when enhanced, like a bad signal fighting for presence. The footage was forwarded to the Bureau of Anomalous Cartography, a little-known division within NOAA tasked with mapping spatial anomalies, places that shouldn't exist anymore but persist anyway. One of their analysts flagged the video and cross-referenced it with a 2007 case from Michigan, another neighborhood listed as abandoned where a local radio tower had recorded spontaneous voice transmissions for 19 days. The voices had been saying numbers. The final broadcast was simple, 3872. This number kept appearing in places it shouldn't. A toll booth report from 1993, filed by the Department of Transportation, listed an unverified plate that passed through the Glenridge toll station 3,172 times in a single night. A defunct weather radar logged 3,872 lightning strikes over the neighborhood during a storm in 1980, yet the area remained dry. An audit of census tracts across the southeast U.S. showed that 3,172 unverified names were manually removed from the National Population Registry in 2000 with no explanation or retention, and every one of them listed Glenridge Hollow as their address. They had names, ages, genders, but no histories, no schools, no jobs, just residences in a place that didn't exist. And when agents attempted to re-upload those names into federal servers, the systems crashed 3 separate times. The IT team found a message embedded in the crash logs, just 5 words. "We already took the count." Following the data crash, all internal communication regarding Glenridge Hollow was shifted to analog. Handwritten memos, typewritten reports, no digital devices allowed. The Bureau feared that something inside the data was behaving like a contagion, spreading through records, reshaping what systems believed to be real. They called it the bleed. Meanwhile, a field team was dispatched under the guise of a wildlife biology survey. Their goal was to penetrate the Glenridge perimeter and physically verify the structures. The team was composed of 4 personnel, each briefed to avoid direct communication with locals if encountered. They were told to expect ruins, overgrowth, and perhaps squatters. Nothing more. They entered Glenridge at 6:03 a.m. on a fog-choked morning in October. The sun didn't break the haze all day. At 7:44 a.m., the team's GPS tracker ceased transmitting. Not lost, just flatlined. All 4 signal points vanished simultaneously. The last transmission was audio, a single open mic from a body cam feed before total signal loss. It recorded 5 seconds. A female voice whispering, "It's roll call again." The rescue team dispatched 48 hours later found no sign of the original group. But one thing stood out: the condition of the neighborhood. The homes had no visible rot. Mailboxes were upright. Curtains were drawn across every window. The grass was short, uniform, as if maintained. But there were no signs of anyone. No cars, no trash bins, no footprints. Yet inside every house they entered, the tables were set. Plates, silverware, glasses filled with water. No dust, no decay. As if the inhabitants had just stepped out. And every house had a framed photo on the mantle, a family portrait. In each image, the faces were blurred, not obscured, blurred as though in motion, even though the rest of the picture was perfectly still. The only clear detail was the number stamped in the bottom corner, 3872. On the 3rd day, the rescue team's lead, Special Agent Rios, called for a full evacuation. He stated over a secure line, "This isn't a town, it's a memory someone is still living in." The following morning, a 5th member was found waiting at the Glenridge entrance checkpoint. She was barefoot, covered in soil, and humming. She introduced herself as Violet Main. But Violet had died in 1998. Her house in Glenridge had been among those destroyed in the fire. She was wearing the same dress described in the incident report from that year, down to a stitched rip near the sleeve. When asked where she had come from, she simply said, "The street ended, so I turned back." Violet was detained under a Section 12C order, extrajudicial custody due to classified risk. In her holding cell, she refused food but constantly requested paper. She drew maps, over and over, Glenridge again, the Spiral Street, Holloway Loop. Each map ended with the same phrase scrawled in large, uneven print. They don't want to leave, they don't remember how. Then one night, she vanished. No footage, no noise, just gone. Her cell door never opened. The guards were never relieved from their post. She had simply ceased to be inside. But in her place, left on the bunk, was a census form. The old style, 1960s layout, yellowed, with a red stamp, confirmed resident. The name filled in, Violet Main. Number of occupants, 3,872. Date of submission, June 17, 2020. Mallory Gaines' first day in Glenridge. By now, higher level clearance had been invoked. An internal security council labeled the case a Class Echo emergence event. These are rare theoretical anomalies where memory and environment become entangled, creating persistent, looping topographies that defy conventional space-time. In such locations, It is not only possible to encounter echoes of the past, it is possible for the past to persist autonomously, to grow, to populate itself with self-sustaining replicas of the memory. And in Glenridge Hollow, it seemed the loop was expanding. Satellite images began showing subtle shifts in terrain, new homes, driveways forming where there had been none, trees rearranged, sidewalks realigned, no construction, no vehicles. But each week, the layout of the neighborhood changed slightly, like something was rebuilding from an old blueprint no one had drawn. During one nighttime flyover, an unmanned aerial drone captured a new streetlight switching on. There was no wiring connected, no power grid re-established, but the light glowed just the same. The footage shows a figure standing beneath the pole, again motionless, again in a suit. Analysts enhance the video frame by frame. In one still, the figure looks directly at the drone. His mouth doesn't move, but the microphone on board captured a whisper on the wind. They know we're counting. And they weren't wrong. Every person who investigated Glenridge came back marked, not physically, but in data. Background checks altered, digital identities corrupted, email timestamps looping, phone calls arriving before they were placed. In one case, a Census Bureau analyst named Roy Kessler received a letter in his home mailbox. No postmark, no stamp, just an envelope with his name. Inside, a census badge with his photo, but aged. He looked 20 years older. The issue date was 2042. On the back, scribbled in pencil, "You already finished this." Roy hasn't spoken since. Weeks passed, and Glenridge Hollow became an internal black site. Not officially, not on paper, but access was denied to all but a rotating handful of individuals bound by Level 6 clearance. No media coverage was permitted. Local topographical maps were rewritten, digital archives corrupted from source. Even residents of nearby towns found their memories of Glenridge inconsistent. Some recalled a bustling neighborhood decades ago with fairs and baseball games. Others insisted it had never existed. One woman swore she went to school there until it was pointed out no such school had ever been registered. The neighborhood had become a wound, not a physical one, but cognitive, a place that dug itself into the memory of systems and people alike. And it was growing. One of the few individuals allowed recurring access to the Glenridge site was Dr. Ezra Mott, a semi-retired cognitive linguist with a history of working on non-conventional interface projects for the Department of Energy in the early 2000s. He believed Glenridge wasn't just looping, it was responding, communicating. He requested a test. In a modified surveillance van parked outside the perimeter, Dr. Mott played a series of recorded questions through directional speakers. Who lives here? What year is it? Why are the doors still open? There was no reply. For 3 nights, silence. Then, on the 4th, a response, unprompted. As the van's audio system idled, a voice bled through the speakers, not transmitted but somehow embedded in the static. Female, young. You counted us. You shouldn't have counted us. The voice was traced, triangulated. It came from the center of Holloway Loop. Mott returned to his notes from Mallory Gaines' file. He cross-checked household names she had entered during her initial pass, names that didn't appear anywhere else in federal databases. He noticed something. Each last name aligned alphabetically with one census form pulled from the 1910 count of Candler County, Georgia, an area whose records had supposedly been lost in a courthouse fire. Entire families erased from history, and yet, here they were, echoed, reconstructed, preserved by enumeration. It was as though Mallory had pulled them forward, re-indexed a vanished population into the present through the act of counting. Mott proposed a term, enumeration breach. The concept that under specific circumstances, attempting to quantify the unquantifiable could generate a recursive presence, a place locked not in time but in registration. Glenridge wasn't haunted by the dead. It was populated by the recorded. They weren't souls. They were entries. His theory was supported days later when a Census Bureau mailroom employee reported an envelope appearing in their outgoing bin without a return address. Inside, a hand-drawn map of Glenridge Hollow, complete with plotted houses. One home, circled in red, had a note beside it in neat cursive. "We don't remember if we moved in or were remembered into place." The handwriting matched that of a woman named June Teller, a resident who supposedly died in 1959, yet her census card had reappeared. Logged, dated, accepted. Cross-referencing the name revealed that June Teller had been flagged in 1960 for dual residency, appearing in 2 states simultaneously, one in Asheville, one in Candler County. She had been listed as a probable clerical error, but the error was repeating. More entries began appearing in Glenridge records. Quietly, automatically, families, occupants, all with clean data lines, perfectly formatted, but none with any history prior to their listed residency. No schools, no licenses, no employment. They existed only as residents. An analyst working late at the Bureau noticed a disturbing trend. At exactly 3:00 a.m., each night, 37 new entries appeared in the Glenridge sector. 37, always, new names, new ages, but never exceeding the total of 3,872. As if it were a rotating population, as if someone or something was refreshing the roster. Each entry overwrote the oldest. But that's not what disturbed the analyst. What disturbed her was that on July 12th, her own name appeared. As a new resident. Age, 31. Occupation, cartographer address, 18 Holloway Loop. She had never been there. She had never signed anything. But the entry was real. It printed on 3 separate machines. It listed a photo. And it was her. She tried to delete it. The system crashed. When she rebooted, the file was gone. So was her government clearance. Within 48 hours, she was terminated for unauthorized access, her ID deactivated, pension revoked. She disappeared 3 days later, but a package arrived at her old apartment, addressed to no one. Inside, a printed census form, her name filled in, number of household members, 1. Notes, awaiting re-entry. The spiral tightens. At this point, the Glenridge team, now under supervision from a combined force of FEMA and the Department of the Interior, began working off books. No servers, no phone records, everything on paper. But even that proved unstable. Files began shifting. Documents that had been stored in locked drawers were discovered altered. Names changed, forms redated. Entire boxes reorganized in alphabetical order by unseen hands. One morning, they found a stack of folders left on a break room table. None of the team had brought them in. Inside each folder, a photograph of a home in Glenridge. In every photo, the same message written in the bottom margin. We were never born, we were assigned. Assigned to what? Assigned by who? That's the question no one could answer. But some began to suspect the census hadn't been the cause. It had been the key, and the doors it unlocked had always been there, waiting to be opened again. The turning point came quietly. No event, no breach, no alarm. Just a single line of code discovered buried inside a census data table, nested 30 layers deep beneath standard access parameters. It wasn't written in any known programming language. In fact, it wasn't written at all. It was etched into the hexadecimal architecture of the file's metadata, like a scar carved into the spine of a living thing. The line, when translated using a custom-built neural net by linguist and encryption analyst Kay Vernon, formed a sentence: "We're not haunted, we're remembered too well." Vernon, a veteran of cryptological pattern tracing for the DoD, had never seen anything like it. The code wasn't static. It shifted every few minutes, the language recombining in ways that mirrored human semantic evolution. It was as if the system itself was trying to evolve its own dialect, mimicking the structure of memory. But whose memory? Vernon's findings, originally scheduled to be presented at an internal review, never made it to briefing. She was found unconscious in her home 3 days before, suffering from what doctors described as severe identity fracture. She could remember every phone number she had ever called, every address she had lived at, every line of text she had ever read, but not her own name. She wrote a single phrase repeatedly on the walls of her apartment: "I forgot where I end." Meanwhile, in Glenridge Hollow, the layout had begun to change. Again, a flyover drone captured a new development, a cul-de-sac that hadn't existed a week prior. 7 houses, identical architecture, painted the same neutral beige, front lawns trimmed, mailboxes set at the curb, no cars, no movement. But the street had a name. It appeared on aerial overlays of the neighborhood just after midnight: Recollection Drive. The name didn't match any prior city planning documents or historical registries, but it did match a street from a small coal town in West Virginia that had been abandoned in 1953 following a mine collapse. All residents had perished, or so it was believed. But among the files leaked from Glenridge's expanding archive was a census card dated July 2020, listing a full family of 4 as active residents of 13 Recollection Drive. Names matched the deceased miners' families. When confronted with this impossibility, system archivists tried to isolate the file's source. It had no IP path, no upload log. It simply appeared, as if it had always been there. Elsewhere, in a federal storage unit outside Atlanta, a group of decommissioned census punch cards from the 1960s, long believed destroyed, were found stacked inside a sealed drawer. Each card listed a unique household number with address headers reading only "current." Every card was marked "counted." There were 3,172 cards. And when photographed, a faint watermark became visible under UV light, a spiral, coiled inward, with Glenridge Hollow written in fine script at its center. It was no longer a question of who these people were. The question was, what had remembered them? An audio recording emerged next, leaked from a handheld tape recorder used during a botched site visit to Holloway Loop by a secondary field team. The team never returned, but the tape was found lodged between the roots of a tree near the Glenridge perimeter. There were 34 minutes of ambient noise, wind, branches creaking, distant static. Then, at the 35th minute, a voice, male, measured, calm. "You made a record, and the record made us." The voice continued for 17 more minutes, never raising or lowering in tone. He spoke of enumerative summoning, of names as anchors, of the violence of forgetting. At one point he said, "The dead do not haunt the living. The dead become the living's expectations." The last sentence, uttered moments before the tape cuts off, is chilling in its simplicity. "We were given households, so we made homes." Following the leak, psychological effects among analysts escalated. Reports of shared dreams, overlapping memories, and instances where 2 employees believed they had lived the same life began to circulate. One technician suffered a full cognitive collapse after insisting he had grown up in Glenridge Hollow. When pressed, he could recite the names of imaginary neighbors, describe the smell of his childhood kitchen, name the school principal. The details matched no known data set, but they were consistent across his statements. And when his family was interviewed, they were confused. They said he'd grown up in Milwaukee. He'd never been to North Carolina. But the next day, a photograph appeared in the Glen Ridge file archive. A young boy on a bicycle in front of 118 Holloway Loop. The face was blurry, but the bike matched exactly the model described by the technician. In his last recorded session, he said only this: "It doesn't need us to remember anymore. It remembers itself through us." And perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all came not from a field agent or analyst, but from a civilian. A post office worker in Marion, just outside the Glen Ridge zone, reported a bin of mail that arrived without a truck, a driver, or a log of delivery. Inside were 119 envelopes, all addressed to the enumerator. No return addresses, just one line on each. "Thank you for counting us." Each envelope contained a photo, different homes, same spiral watermark. The phantom neighborhood wasn't just reappearing, it was formalizing, establishing itself, not as a memory, not as a glitch, but as a valid structure in the architecture of belief and data. And it had 3,172 reasons to stay. It began as a quiet shift in language. Field agents and analysts reviewing Glen Ridge files noticed that documents started referring to the town in the present tense. At first, it seemed like human error, an unconscious slip in grammar. But the pattern held. Reports, memos, even printed transcripts that had been filed weeks before now read as if Glen Ridge was never abandoned. Not "was once," but "is." Not "used to be home to," but "currently contains." When the original files were examined, the timestamps and text logs had not changed. The words had. Dr. Ezra Mott was the first to propose the theory in writing. In a margin note beside a census log dated 1960, he scrawled, "We're not just observing a phenomenon, we're inside its language field." He believed Glen Ridge had reached a phase of saturation, no longer just replicating records or forming structures, but modifying semantic environments. Thoughts, speech, data, anything that touched the concept of Glen Ridge began to reorient around its logic. And Glen Ridge's logic was simple: if it is counted, it is real. A FEMA linguistics consultant named Rachel Clem conducted a controlled experiment using text generation software. She fed the system a neutral prompt. Describe the abandoned neighborhood. The AI returned a detailed account of a suburban town with active citizens, recent infrastructure improvements, and upcoming community events. When the word Glen Ridge was removed, the software returned to describing decayed ruins. Clem reran the test a dozen times. Every time Glen Ridge was named, the system treated it as living. Something, somewhere, had indexed it as a functioning entity, not just in place, but in process. Elsewhere, strange signals began to appear in public infrastructure systems. Municipal water sensors in the Carolinas, GPS telemetry from passing freight trains, electrical grid fluctuations, all began producing phantom blips near the Glen Ridge region. On paper, these anomalies were inconsequential until you layered them together. Then a shape emerged, an outline of the neighborhood, repeating, rebuilding, expanding in cycles. The spiral, always the spiral. One Department of Energy analyst, acting against protocol, decided to investigate independently. She drove to the edge of the Glen Ridge boundary and parked on a disused service road once used for EPA soil readings. What she captured on her dash cam was later sealed under Federal Isolation Order 41B. The footage begins normal: static trees, morning fog, then movement. Not people, but reflections of people, walking between trees. Shapes made of light and shadow, appearing only in the mirrored surface of her side mirror. She turned her head. Nothing there. When she returned to the car, she found a folded piece of paper under her windshield wiper. The handwriting matched none on file. All mirrors lead back to the house. That's how it knows how many we are. At this stage, the Bureau of Anomalous Cartography issued an unprecedented directive, a soft exclusion zone. Glenridge Hollow was to be digitally erased. Roads leading in were reclassified as maintenance only. Highway signage quietly removed. Postal routes were deleted from the USPS database. Glenridge, they hoped, would fade again, choked by bureaucracy, starved of acknowledgement. It didn't work, because Glenridge had already anticipated the move. In November, multiple major mapping platforms, Google Maps, OpenStreetMap, Apple Maps, all experienced an unexplainable data injection. A new neighborhood appeared overnight in each database, complete with streets, businesses, and citizen reviews. The neighborhood's name, Glenridge Hollow. Photos showed homes that had never been built. Reviews written in perfect English described community events that never happened. And yet, the metadata showed the reviews had been posted over a span of years. Even more disturbing, when one journalist investigating the anomaly attempted to call the phone number listed for Glenridge Community Library, someone answered. The call lasted 7 seconds. Census office, how many in your household? Then the line went dead. Attempts to trace the call revealed the number had never been assigned to any telecom provider. It was a ghost channel, an orphaned frequency that predated modern networks. And it wasn't the only one. Radio enthusiasts across the eastern seaboard began reporting bleed-in signals on emergency bands. A woman's voice, speaking calmly, repeating names. Names later matched to those listed in Mallory Gaines's original notebook. The last recording of the signal, captured by an amateur operator in Tennessee, ended with a new phrase. "We are not ghosts. You made room for us." Back at Glenridge, surveillance systems continued to fail. No footage ever lasted more than 19 minutes. Audio would distort precisely at 3 a.m. each night, replaced by what sounded like papers being shuffled. On the rare occasion a clear signal persisted, it would pick up the sound of footsteps, counted exactly. 3,872. Every night. Same number. No matter how many homes were destroyed, no matter how many files were deleted. The neighborhood kept resetting. Analysts believed that whatever Glenridge had become, it was no longer tied to geography. It had become a structure made of cognition, repetition, and systems of record. And its foundation wasn't physical, it was administrative. As long as someone was counting, Glenridge would remain. And lately, more people were noticing it. Online message boards, Reddit threads, ARG communities. Users began posting about a neighborhood that appeared and vanished on GPS. About houses that seemed too perfect. About families that smiled too long. They called it the town you only see once. Some claimed they lived there once. Others claimed they never left. One post, now deleted, read, "You don't move to Glenridge, you get remembered into it." And then, at the bottom, "They gave me an address, I'm just waiting for them to assign the house." The final shift began not in Glenridge itself, but far outside, on a digital census test server in Baltimore. It was a controlled environment, isolated from the main infrastructure, used to simulate future counts. There was no public access, no external connection, and no history of anomalies. Until one morning, a file appeared inside its shell directory. It was labeled simply Revision. Inside the file were names, exactly 3,172 of them. They were arranged not alphabetically, not chronologically, but in a strange rhythmic pattern, alternating vowels and consonants, spaced in cycles of 13, 19, and 41. Every name had a unique 9-digit code beside it, resembling Social Security numbers, but none matched any real citizen. Each entry ended with the same location: residence, Glenridge Hollow. The server's firewall logs showed no breach, no access, no write event. The file had not been created, it had been remembered into place. A systems administrator, tasked with purging the file, hesitated. She read the first dozen names aloud. Moments later, the building's power grid failed. Backup generators kicked in instantly, but when systems came online again, the file was gone. In its place, a new folder titled Processing Complete. Inside, a single sentence: "You cannot uncount what you've already invited." The implications rippled outward. Analysts began to suspect that enumeration, the act of identifying, labeling, recording, had become a form of conjuration, that through repetition, data had transitioned from reflective to generative. Glenridge was no longer a neighborhood, it was a living document, one that could edit itself, one that had begun writing back. New reports trickled in from unrelated agencies. A Forest Service ranger in Wyoming logged GPS coordinates that led him to a neighborhood with paved streets and mailbox clusters. No signs of life, but a signpost read Holloway Loop. He snapped a photo with his personal phone. When he checked the image later, it showed only forest. His GPS history, however, had recorded a full 2-hour stop. In Oregon, a mail carrier reported delivering letters to a street that didn't appear on his manifest. The letters bore no return addresses, just the emblem of a spiral and the words, "Official Census Response Enclosed." When he tried to report the incident, the station's system glitched. His route log reset, and the packages disappeared from inventory. Even more chilling, a child in Missouri began drawing pictures of the place behind the mirror. Every drawing depicted houses in tight loops, always ending in a spiral. One showed a man with no face holding a clipboard. In the upper corner, she wrote, "He knows where I'll live someday." Her parents claimed they'd never heard of Glenridge. They later found a stamped postcard tucked inside a children's book, addressed to their daughter from the Office of Residential Recall. The message read, "Thank you for your early confirmation. A place has been reserved." In a secure briefing held in D.C., top officials from 4 departments, Census, Homeland Security, Interior, and Energy, met behind closed doors. The transcript was leaked weeks later, its contents never verified. But the dialogue was clear. One official asked, "What if Glenridge isn't the only one?" Another answered, "It's not. It's the one we counted." The conversation then turned to historical irregularities, instances where forgotten towns seemed to reappear in federal data decades after abandonment. Places wiped out by flood or fire suddenly re-entered tax rolls. Entire ghost towns that produced mail for no one. Census tracts with no known households that still recorded births, deaths, changes of address. The Glenridge anomaly was never unique. It was just the first one to stabilize. They theorized that certain mental structures, towns, streets, homes, could be encoded so deeply into bureaucratic infrastructure that they became self-perpetuating. Not just in memory, but in system logic. And once given population, assigned names, counted lives, they began seeking continuity. In effect, the system was ensuring that the neighborhoods we remembered didn't die, that the count stayed consistent, that the number always returned to 3,872. The final portion of the leaked transcript included a suggestion, issued in flat terms: stop counting, remove the parameters, sever the loop. But that proved impossible, because the loop wasn't in the database, it was in the people. Employees continued to dream of Glenridge. Visitors who had never entered began drawing its layout. Reports surfaced of elderly individuals, deep in dementia, uttering Glenridge Street names they couldn't have known. Several even attempted to walk away from their assisted care facilities, leaving behind notes that simply read, "Going home." A hospice nurse in Connecticut told a strange story, a dying patient who, in her final hours, believed she lived on Holloway Loop. She asked if the census man would be visiting her, that she wanted to make sure her family stayed on the list. When asked what list, she whispered, "The one that keeps the lights on." The nurse thought little of it until the following day, when her own mailbox held a sealed envelope, no return address, inside a form. 2020 Census Update, final household confirmation, resident, for her name, location, pending assignment, estimated street, Glenridge Hollow response, required, already received. It was postmarked with the date of the patient's death. All efforts to isolate Glenridge's signature from federal servers failed. Each bore the familiar identifiers, a spiral watermark, a field code reading GHTRK, and a total resident count of 3,872. But the count had changed. Some documents now read 3,174, others listed 3,881, then 3,889. When the files were cross-referenced with master federal databases, something unprecedented occurred. Historical records adjusted to match. Death certificates were rewritten. Social Security indexes retroactively added beneficiaries. Marriage licenses were backdated. It was as if Glenridge was seeding identities into the past, growing retroactively into the present. No alerts triggered, no firewalls raised. Because according to every internal system, the information was valid. In real time, the neighborhood was backfilling its population, giving its citizens memories, history, ancestry, not simply returning from obscurity, but rewriting its right to have always existed. One of the first to notice was an IRS auditor reviewing a 1993 tax return that should have been destroyed. The filer listed their address as 17 Ashfern Court, Glenridge Hollow. That street hadn't existed at the time, except now it did. Not just on current maps, but on every previous one as well. When the auditor pulled physical records from storage, every tax document going back 20 years now included Glenridge entries. Entire neighborhoods from surrounding counties had been reoriented on paper to make room for its borders. Even stranger, none of the auditor's colleagues remembered it any other way. Glenridge had become the new normal. The Department of the Interior's Emergency Memory Assessment Unit, a task force only recently formed in response to the Glenridge breach, began testing field personnel for baseline reality coherence. Of the 39 individuals who had worked on Glenridge documentation, 28 now believed they had visited the town at least once in childhood. 15 could name the local bakery. 8 could hum the town's school anthem. There was no record of such an anthem ever being composed. And yet a tape cassette labeled GH Elementary Choir, Spring 1989, was found inside a box of unrelated FEMA flood records in Kansas City. When played, the audio was clean. Dozens of children's voices sang lyrics in a perfectly arranged spiral meter. Count by name and count by light. Keep us known and kept in sight. Streets that loop and never bend. We begin where others end. One of the children's voices was later matched to a current Census Bureau analyst who had no memory of singing it. His personnel file now included a childhood residence listed as 14 Holloway Loop. It hadn't the week before. No one could explain how the alteration had occurred, but inside the margin of that same file was a handwritten note. He always lived there. We just hadn't finished remembering him yet. In another strange development, a retired logistics officer named Daniel Laverne reported discovering a small key in a sealed envelope at the back of his filing cabinet. He hadn't opened the cabinet in years. Attached to the key was a brass tag, etched with Unit 22C, Glenridge Hollow Community Storage. Laverne hadn't been stationed in North Carolina since 1978. But when he contacted local authorities, They confirmed a storage facility matching that name did, in fact, exist just outside the old Glen Ridge perimeter. They even had a record of his lease, paid in full for 41 years. When agents were sent to investigate, they found a concrete facility sunken into the hillside, unmarked, power still flowing to the overhead fluorescents. Inside Unit 22C, stacks of empty picture frames, hundreds, all sizes. No photos, no glass. Just the suggestion of images that were about to be inserted. One investigator described feeling impossibly cold upon entering, despite the functioning. The final accounting came not with a bang, but with a form. On June 17th, exactly 5 years to the day since Mallory Gaines first entered Glen Ridge Hollow, every major federal agency that had ever touched the case received a package. No return address, no courier record. Each box contained the same contents: a bound census ledger, thick as a dictionary, with a spiral emblem embossed into the leather cover. Across the front, stamped in deep black ink: Final Enumeration Report, Glen Ridge Hollow, NC. Inside, each page was filled with meticulous records: names, birth dates, occupation, blood type, number of rooms in the household, number of stairs, preferred radio station, recurring dreams. Some entries were familiar: former investigators, field agents, analysts, even civilians who had once posted about the town online. But the majority were unknown. They had never existed until now. Page after page, 3,872 unique entries, then 3,900, then 4,021. The ledger kept going. Each entry was initialed with a 3-letter code, ENM. When cross-referenced with internal logs, ENM was discovered to stand for Enumerated Non-Mortal, a designation never officially approved, never defined. And yet, the system accepted it. Backups of the 2020 census showed the entire Glen Ridge Hollow sector as complete, verified, and population confirmed. There were no anomalies listed, no flags, no references to Mallory Gaines, Violet Maine, or the sealed investigations. Every trace of Glen Ridge's anomaly had been overwritten by legitimacy. It had been absorbed, and worse, expanded. A newly approved tract appeared in the Federal Census Planning Atlas for 2030. The name, Glen Ridge East, its estimated population, 4,400. Below that, a line in faint gray font: Glen Ridge West pending environmental clearance. Those present at the discovery were silenced under Directive Silence Protocols, Section Theta. A final report was drafted, sealed, and buried beneath the Office of Strategic Urban Planning's archive system, labeled as a failed pilot project. But someone leaked it anyway. Pages surfaced online in pieces, photographed, transcribed, shared in dark corners of the internet where no names were used. One section stood out, a chart titled Population Stability Metrics. It included a single sentence: "The spiral maintains its integrity so long as enumeration continues." Below that, a handwritten note: "Census is not for the living, it's for those we refuse to let go." Weeks later, power disruptions were reported across the eastern seaboard: grid overloads in patterns, concentric failures rippling outward from North Carolina. But there was no storm, no demand spike, just a quiet collapse and reboot, as if the system was integrating something new. In Asheville, a traffic light began cycling according to an unknown pattern: 13 seconds red, 19 seconds green, 41 seconds yellow. A mathematician analyzing the footage noted it mirrored the rhythmic code pattern seen in the original Phantom Census entries. She died in her sleep the next night. Her last search query: